He was called the King before he was even 30. A voice that could melt the hardest heart, a smile that could ignite a room, and a stage presence that felt otherworldly. Elvis Presley wasn't just a singer, he was the birth of modern celebrity. Yet behind the screaming fans and rhinestone jumpsuits lay a man slowly losing control of his own creation. He revolutionized music, defied the barriers of race and culture, and became a global symbol of youth and rebellion. But the higher he climbed, the lonelier he became. The very fame that made him immortal would one day lead him to his knees. This is the story of Elvis Presley, the man who gave the world rock and roll and paid for it with his soul. Elvis Aaron Presley was born on January 8, 1935, in Tupelo, Mississippi, to Vernon and Gladys Presley. His twin brother Jesse Guerin was stillborn, leaving Elvis as the only surviving child, a fact that haunted him throughout his life. The family was poor, deeply religious, and devoted to one another. They lived in a tiny two-room house built by his father, a place where gospel music and Southern hardship intertwined. His mother Gladys adored him fiercely, seeing him as her miracle child while his father struggled to keep work and provide for the family. The Presleys attended the local Assembly of God church, where Elvis first felt the emotional force of gospel singing. The music filled him with something he couldn't yet name, an intensity that felt divine. As a boy, he was shy, polite, and awkward, far from the electrifying performer he would become. But something was forming inside him, a restless energy, a need to express himself through sound and motion. In 1948, the family moved to Memphis, Tennessee, a city bursting with musical cross-currents. On Beale Street, Elvis heard the sounds of rhythm and blues spilling out of clubs, mixing with country and gospel. He listened to B.B. King and Roy Brown, absorbed the swagger of the blues, and soaked up the spirit of the South. These were the ingredients that would later fuse into rock and roll. By his teenage years, Elvis was already different. He wore flashy clothes, grew his hair long, and carried his guitar everywhere. People in his neighborhood thought he was strange. What they didn't see was a young man quietly sharpening the blade of a revolution. In 1953, at the age of 18, Elvis walked into the small Memphis recording service to cut a record for his mother. The owner, Sam Phillips, founder of Sun Records, heard something extraordinary in the young man's voice, a blend of black rhythm and blues and white country soul. When Elvis began recording with guitarist Scotty Moore and bassist Bill Black, something electric happened. Their version of Arthur Crudup's That's All Right in 1954 exploded onto local radio. It didn't sound like anything else on earth. Within weeks, the South was on fire with a new sound. Elvis's energy was uncontrollable. He moved differently, sang differently, looked different. When he performed, the audience, especially the women, screamed as if possessed. Television appearances followed, each one more controversial than the last. The way he shook his hips and smiled at the camera outraged parents and preachers, but thrilled an entire generation. They called it sinful, but to millions of young people, it was liberation. By 1956, Elvis had signed with RCA Records, released Heartbreak Hotel, and sold over 1 million copies in weeks. The same year, he appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, and over 60 million Americans tuned in. Overnight, he became the most famous man in America. His combination of charm, sensuality, and raw emotion redefined what a performer could be. He wasn't just making music, he was breaking cultural walls. Then came Hollywood. Movies like Love Me Tender and Jailhouse Rock made him a box office sensation. His face was everywhere on posters, lunchboxes, and magazines. In just a few years, the boy from Tupelo had become a global icon. But even as his fame skyrocketed, he remained humble in interviews, shyly thanking fans and clutching his mother's hand backstage. To the world, he was unstoppable. To those close to him, the pressure was beginning to show. By the late 1950s, Elvis Presley was no longer just a singer. He was a cultural revolution wrapped in blue suede shoes. He had brought black and white music together on the same stage, shattered social boundaries, and turned rebellion into a brand. But in 1958, just as he stood at the top of the world, his career paused. Elvis was drafted into the U.S. Army. For 2 years, the king of rock and roll traded rhinestones for khakis, serving in Germany as an ordinary soldier. It was during this period that tragedy struck. His mother Gladys died suddenly of heart failure. Her death broke something inside him. Those close to him said he never truly recovered. When he returned to America in 1960, Elvis was greeted like a hero. He resumed recording, releasing hits such as It's Now or Never and Are You Lonesome Tonight? His voice was more mature, his style smoother. But Hollywood soon consumed him. Through the 1960s, he made over 24 films, lightweight musicals filled with songs and scenery, but little soul. The money poured in, but his artistry began to stagnate. He was rich, handsome, adored, yet creatively trapped in a formula that dulled his fire. By the late 60s, rock music had changed. The Beatles, Bob Dylan, and the Rolling Stones had taken the rebellion he started and pushed it further. Elvis seemed out of place, a relic of another era. But in 1968, he reminded the world who he was. The '68 comeback special, filmed in a small TV studio with just a black leather outfit and raw energy, reignited his legend. His voice was powerful again, his charisma undeniable. The king was back, not as an idol, but as a man reclaiming his crown. That momentum carried him into Las Vegas. In 1969, his residency at the International Hotel, redefined live performance and orchestra, a full choir, dazzling lights, and the magnetic presence of Elvis in white jumpsuits. Night after night, the world's biggest names came to see him. Once again, he ruled the stage. But beneath the rhinestones and applause, a different rhythm had begun, the slow, quiet beat of exhaustion and isolation. By the early 1970s, the image of Elvis Presley was larger than life. But the man behind it was beginning to crumble. The Las Vegas shows that had resurrected his fame now trapped him in a glittering cage. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, pushed for endless performances and merchandise deals, while Elvis's personal world shrank behind the neon lights of the Strip. He was performing twice a night, 7 days a week, for crowds that worshipped him. But when the curtain fell, he returned to empty hotel suites and prescription bottles lined across the dresser. His marriage to Priscilla Presley, which had begun as a fairy tale, was disintegrating. Years of separation, infidelity, and the strain of fame tore them apart. In 1973, they divorced, and Elvis was left devastated. He adored his daughter, Lisa Marie, but even fatherhood couldn't fill the growing void. The once vibrant man who had electrified television screens now spent nights alone, numbing himself with pills to sleep and pills to wake. Creatively, he was at war with himself. While the world had moved into a new age of rock, funk, and disco, Elvis was still bound by the expectations of a nostalgia-driven audience. His manager refused to let him tour internationally, fearing loss of control, and forced him to recycle old hits in endless American circuits. The man who had once redefined music now performed as a reflection of his former glory. Physically, his body began to betray him. The weight gain, the erratic behavior, the slurred speech, all signs of dependence and decline. Yet on stage, the voice remained powerful. Even at his lowest, he could still command a room with a single note. To fans, he was eternal. To himself, he was fading. The king was still standing under the lights, but behind the microphone, the war was already lost. By 1976, Elvis Presley was living inside the ruins of his own empire. Graceland, once the symbol of triumph and youth, had become a fortress of isolation. The gates were locked, curtains drawn, and only a handful of trusted aides were allowed inside. He barely left the property, except to perform. And even those performances were a shadow of what they once were. Fans still screamed his name, but the man on stage was almost unrecognizable. His once slim frame had swollen, his eyes were often glassy, and his movements sluggish. The king of rock and roll now looked tired, sick, and lost. His addiction to prescription drugs had deepened. Doctors enabled his habits, writing endless prescriptions for sedatives, painkillers, and stimulants. He carried vials of pills in briefcases wherever he went, convinced he needed them just to function. Friends later said he was trapped in a cycle of exhaustion, depression, and paranoia, his body giving out under the weight of fame and medication. Still, he kept touring. Between 1966 and 1977, Elvis performed over 100 shows, many of them barely coherent. At times, he slurred lyrics, forgot lines, or collapsed backstage. But the audiences refused to see the decline. For them, Elvis was still the legend who could do no wrong. His final concerts were filled with desperation and flashes of brilliance, a man fighting his own body to deliver one last spark of what made him immortal. On August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley was found unconscious in the bathroom of Graceland. The official cause of death, cardiac arrest, brought on by an overdose of prescription drugs. He was 42 years old. The news stunned the world. Crowds flooded the gates of Graceland, sobbing and singing his songs through the night. The media called it the death of the American dream, the fall of the first true modern icon. The boy from Tupelo, who had changed the sound of the world, died alone, surrounded by everything except peace. Elvis Presley's death in 1977 did not silence him. It immortalized him. Within hours, the world went into mourning. Radios played his songs non-stop. Newspapers printed special editions, and tens of thousands gathered outside Graceland as his body lay in repose. His funeral drew crowds that stretched for miles, a reflection of the profound connection he had forged with ordinary people. But as tributes poured in, so did the questions. How could the most famous man in America die so young, so lonely, so broken? In the months that followed, the myths began. Sightings of Elvis were reported everywhere, at gas stations, diners, airports. For many, it was easier to believe he was alive than to accept that the king was gone. His image took on a life of its own, frozen in white jumpsuits and glory, forever singing to a crowd that would never stop cheering. Meanwhile, the industry that had both made and consumed him wasted no time. Reissues of his albums, flooded stores, documentaries were produced, and Graceland became a shrine. By the 1980s, it had turned into one of the most visited homes in America, second only to the White House. Elvis had become more than a musician. He was a symbol of America itself, brilliant, flawed, excessive, and endlessly mythologized. But as time passed, a clearer truth emerged. Elvis's story was not just about fame, it was about fragility. He had carried the burden of being first, of inventing what it meant to be a modern superstar with no roadmap and no escape. He opened doors for generations of artists, black and white, rich and poor, yet never found freedom for himself. Behind the glamour and the glory was a man who longed for simplicity, for love, for peace of mind. Today, his music still resonates. His voice, deep, trembling, and alive, continues to echo through history. But his life stands as both a miracle and a warning that greatness achieved without balance becomes its own destruction. Elvis didn't just change the world of music. He revealed the human cost of being adored by it. Elvis Presley's life is more than a story of fame. It is a parable about the fragility of dreams. He began as a poor boy with nothing but a guitar and a voice that carried the soul of a nation. He gave the world a sound it had never heard before and embodied a freedom it desperately wanted. But the same fire that made him extraordinary also consumed him. He was trapped between who he was and what the world demanded him to be: a son, a soldier, a sex symbol, a savior of American music. He stood beneath lights that burned too hot for any man to endure, surrounded by applause that eventually drowned out his own heartbeat. The world saw the crown, but not the cost. His fall wasn't the failure of a man. It was the price of being the first to walk the path of global fame without a map. Every artist who came after him would walk through doors that he opened, but none would escape the shadow he left behind. And so the legend of Elvis lives on not as a perfect idol, but as a human being who carried both glory and grief in equal measure. His story reminds us that the pursuit of immortality often begins with innocence and ends in isolation. Yet even now, decades after his death, his voice still trembles through speakers filled with longing, passion, and a trace of the boy from Tupelo who only ever wanted to sing. Because in the end, Elvis Presley didn't just change music. He revealed the truth of what it means to give everything for it.